Our guests today, Allison Handy, a partner of Perkins Coie, and Shannon Cartales, senior lead counsel of Zillow, both in Seattle, Washington, are doing 8 things about the proxy season you should know. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point. Hey, Allison, Shannon, so excited. Our first big guy with lightning round ping pong on the proxy season. Allison, take it away.
Thanks, Brock. All right, so first thing for the proxy season, virtual annual meetings. I know, I think we've been talking about virtual annual meetings since 2009, but 2020, that was the year. Everybody had to switch thanks to COVID-19. And so I'm interested to see whether after this year, we really see more growth in these. You know, there were some really unique issues for the 2020 season. We're not going to get into all of those, but I think, you know, now companies are a little more focused on thinking about what are the state law rules? Can we do a virtual meeting under state law rules? What are the requirements we have to do, you know, have to fulfill? What do we have to put in the proxy statement? What do we have to write on the proxy card? How do we make this happen? So I guess the tip really is just think about state law if you're going to do this. Think about your investors. You know, they have been really, there are some big institutional investors who've been against virtual annual meetings, but maybe after 2020, they'll be a little more open.
Yeah, and after testing out on the company side, the virtual meeting in 2020, there were definitely a lot of pros and a lot of cons to think about when we consider we're doing it again in 2021 and future years. On the plus side, the technology is surprisingly easy and implementation was pretty quick and painless, and our executives found that it was pretty easy to use. And the format, despite what some investors seem to think, does allow for a lot of shareholders to have ready access to the meeting and provides an easy forum for them to ask questions of the management and the board, and reduces the requirements for them to travel and make other logistical considerations. But because of that, especially if you're a company that traditionally doesn't have a lot of attendance or questions, you have to be prepared for them because they can increase as a result of implementing a virtual meeting. So you have to think about how you want to respond, how you're going to deal with questions as they arise, and make sure to post rules that clearly set out the expectations about how the meeting is going to operate and how you're going to handle Q&A. So moving to point 2, in preparing for the proxy statement and annual meeting, it's important to create a calendar. Much of proxy season is about project management, and there are a lot of players and work streams related to preparing the proxy, getting it printed, filed, and mailed. So I find that starting the season with a very detailed and comprehensive calendar that is both reviewed by and communicated to all of your key stakeholders and provides you with cushions for those unexpected events and delays that are inevitably going to arise can make your life a lot easier and ensure that you're not going to end up getting jammed up if, you know, at some point in the process, there is an unexpected event that occurs or a missed deadline. So that calendar, a lot of organization at the front end can pay a lot of dividends throughout the season.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that, the interaction of the different service providers that, I mean, I think you lay that out in the timeline, and I think that was one of the things we saw in 2020, which was, you know, if a lot of companies were suddenly needing to switch to a virtual meeting and they needed to make sure that the code that was on the proxy card was going to work for their virtual meeting provider as a way for the people to get into the meetings and those kinds of things. So keeping everyone up to speed and making sure people are talking to each other, I think is really, really key there.
Yeah, there's so much behind the scenes coordination between the service providers that folks don't recognize until they start actually driving a proxy season, and it's critical to make sure they're all collaborating in an effective and efficient way. Okay, so moving on to the next point, sharing proxy statement disclosure early and then often with your internal stakeholders to coordinate internal and external messaging is super important. So the proxy statement, unlike some of your other SEC filings that are a bit more financially driven, contains a lot of information that can be interesting on a personal level to stakeholders other than investors. So your employees might pick up on executive comp disclosures, pay ratio, pay equality, and other topics, and the media often is interested in this disclosure as well. So I find that it's critical to bring both your investor relations team and your comms team into the process while the proxy is still in draft. Make sure that those groups are kind of aware of the different issues and disclosure requirements that are going to be in play this proxy season. They can then help support preparation of the proxy and help you think through potentially sensitive disclosure. Think about if you want to, enhance that disclosure to provide additional context for certain matters that might be particularly interesting to employees or the media. And then you can help prepare them to respond to those questions should they arise once the proxy gets filed. Because again, it's all about good coordination between your stakeholders, and that rule applies to the internal stakeholders who are going to have to respond to potential questions and issues that arise post-filing.
Yeah, that's such a great tip, and honestly, something that as a law firm lawyer, I don't see that. So knowing that my clients are going through that and that that's part of their process, and understanding that that's what they're thinking about in drafting is really helpful for me. So I'll move on to our point number 4, which is voting requirements and the importance to get them right. I don't think people realize just how technical and difficult this can be. I mean, you think, okay, it's one company, voting requirements will all be the same. Maybe the directors are different, but that's it. It is very, very detailed. Majority means very different things. You really have to read the actual words, look at the state law, look at the bylaws, and make sure you're disclosing it correctly, because the last thing you want is having, said it was explained how abstentions work and to have gotten that wrong, to have said abstentions don't count, and then suddenly actually abstentions are a vote against. So that's just one of those things that you really need to spend the time to get it right. And it's also important to, once you put the disclosure in the proxy statement, maybe, the one lawyer, the securities lawyer is is the person who writes up that disclosure, they get it all right. And then the general counsel is looking at the report from the vote tabulator, and they may have no idea whether they're going to get the vote or not, because they need to understand those voting requirements too. So, maybe that securities lawyer can give them a crib sheet, say, okay, here's the line to look at for item number 2, and here's the line you look at for item number 3. So we're moving on to number 5, which is the other materials that you send out to shareholders. The critical thing here, and I think Brock was pleased to see my use of the technical term, additional soliciting materials. So that's what I think it's called under the SEC rule. If you're sending out materials to shareholders during proxy season, even if they're not, specifically get out the vote materials, the SEC can take a really wide view of what shareholder-directed communications might influence the vote, especially these days when ISS or your institutional shareholders might be considering sort of the company's corporate governance on a very broad scale in deciding how to vote for directors and other things that are on the ballot. A lot of the things that you put out might be considered soliciting materials, and if a company puts out additional soliciting materials after the proxy statement's filed, they need to file those as well with the SEC. So it's worth checking with your outside counsel, or really giving it some thought as you're preparing any shareholder directed communication during proxy season.
Okay, number 6.
Yeah.
Have an action plan ready in connection with the shareholder proposal process. As I said before, so much of proxy season is about project management, and the better that you can manage the process and be prepared and get organized on the front end, the better equipped you're going to be to handle those unforeseeable events or surprises that come up during the season. One of the biggest surprises can be when the shareholder comes in with a proposal, and there are a lot of important dates and tight timelines that come into play when you have a shareholder proposal submitted. So in your proxy season calendar, it's great if you can include reference to the dates that you disclosed in last year's proxy statement about when shareholder proposals can be submitted. And then if shareholder proposals do come in during that period, you'll want to calendar the dates that relate to your no action requests and sharing the board statement in opposition with the proponent. And also think about calendaring a time to make sure that you're checking in with the shareholder in advance of the annual meeting if they're going to be attending and speaking about their proposals there. So in addition, when you get that shareholder proposal, there's a lot of decisions that you have to make quickly because you don't generally know the topic of the proposal before it comes in the door. So you have to make decisions about how the company is going to respond. And there's not a lot of time usually between when you actually receive that proposal and the deadlines for submitting a no action request. So you need to make sure that you know who the key players are, who the key decision makers are, and the team that needs to be involved in the process. Review the proposal, work with outside counsel to understand, if it was properly submitted, and whether there are reasonable arguments that you can use to exclude the proposal under the no action request letter process. Then decide, are you going to engage with the shareholder proposal to try to come to some agreement in advance of the proxy statement, or are you going to potentially, just take a position on the proposal in your proxy? And then, of course, working closely with your management and your board to either have them approve a policy change in connection with the settlement, or draft your statement in opposition, or complete the analysis needed in connection with some of your no action relief arguments. And just talking about it, you can tell that this is a pretty hectic process. It all happens pretty quickly, and it often, for companies like Zillow, that our calendar year happens around the holidays when there's people on vacation and there's a lot of other matters to attend to. So it's just important, again, to make sure that you're clear on what the steps are if you get a proposal, who the key players are internally and externally that you need to involve in that process, and have that action plan ready so that if you get a shareholder proposal, you're ready to go. And the biggest issues are just working through the nature of the proposal and how you're going to solve for it.
That's, I think, really great advice. And I will completely echo what you just said. I think the vast majority of no action request letters that I've submitted have been submitted between December 20th and December 23rd. It's always the case. So another point on those shareholder proposals, this is our point number 7, be prepared for the possibility that a proponent might file an exempt solicitation. This has been around for a long time. There are, various institutional holders who do a lot of no action or do a lot of shareholder proposals who have been doing these files for years. But in 2018, it kind of took off, and a lot more, the corporate gadfly types kind of started picking this up as well. So what this means is an exempt solicitation is a filing on Edgar. It comes up in the company's Edgar feed, but the filing is made by a shareholder. And the shareholder, as long as that shareholder isn't soliciting proxy cards itself, it's just kind of recommending how people vote. They don't have to file a proxy statement, but if they fit into certain categories, they might have to file an exempt solicitation. What the shareholder proponents have found, and the SEC has agreed, is that even if you don't meet those standards to file, even if you don't have enough shares or you're not sending it to enough people, you can still file an exempt solicitation voluntarily. So they basically, it's free publicity for the proponent. And if they really feel that, the company needs simple majority voting and they want to, really get their message out to shareholders, they might do these filings. So it's just important for companies to know that this could happen. Be prepared and consider whether or not you want to respond. You don't have to respond. The company's already put out a statement. It has its board statement in opposition to a proposal in there. There might be nothing else you want to say, but depending on the company, how they feel about shareholder proposals and these kinds of things, they may want to put out an additional statement, file some additional proxy materials. It's just one to be aware of and to know that it might be coming.
Okay, our last issue or item is number 8, which is getting ahead of proxy season hot topics by engaging with shareholders in the off season. So as we all know, the proxy season can be a really great place to highlight the good stuff that the company is doing on social and governance efforts. And in order to use that proxy statement effectively on those topics, it's important to both start early and understand what people care about. So, during the off season, which is traditionally the period between when you have your annual shareholder meeting and when you file your annual report, it's it's an ideal time to engage with your investors. So your investor relations team, when they're talking to your major shareholders, to understand, what are their concerns on the ESG front? What do they want to see you do more of? What are they most interested in that you're already doing that you can highlight? And just thinking about, how what you're doing fits into the ESG, best practices and requirements that are kind of put out by the shareholder community. And then use that information to help guide your disclosure in the proxy statement, and this is why it's important to kind of start early and think about this in advance of proxy season. If there are things that your investors are asking for you to do that you actually think are great ideas and you want to adopt, that gives you enough time to work with your management team, work with your board of directors to make policy changes so that you're able to, make changes in light of what the investors are asking for, and then have done it in enough time to be able to highlight that great work and those new initiatives in your proxy statement. So, a great example right now, and that I think we're going to see a lot of continued disclosure on, is diversity, board diversity, and kind of related issues are huge topics in the space and in the institutional shareholder community. And a lot of them have been quite vocal and submitted proposals asking companies for more disclosure about diversity topics and equity topics. And so getting ahead of that and working with your internal teams to understand what you're doing on that front and being able to then highlight it in your proxy statement can help, promote your relationships with your investors and also enhance your scores with the institutional shareholder community.
Yeah, and I'll just add one minor point here. Depending on the size of the company, these institutional shareholders might not take your meeting or might not have the time to meet with you. And so you can look at what they put out, look at the BlackRock letter every year, the letter to CEOs. Institutional shareholders aren't shy to tell you what they're focused on. And if they don't have the time or they're not going to engage with your company, you can still get ahead of it, even if you're not actually having the direct face-to-face conversation.
Great stuff. Practical advice, sage advice. Thank you so much, Allison and Shannon.
Thanks.
Thank you.